Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, 5 Brilliant Ways to Customize SAP Business by Design. My name is Whitney Mahon, and I'm an account executive here at FMT Consultants, and I'm joined by Dan Edelman, FMT's Senior SAP by Design Consultant. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who will be going over our agenda for today. But before I do so, if at any time during the presentation you have any questions, feel free to type them in the comment box, and I will be monitoring it during the entire presentation, and we will answer them at the end. Dan?
Thank you, Whitney. Good morning and/or afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending the webinar. In today's session, we're going to take a look at custom development in Business by Design. This is using the Cloud Application Studio that's specifically tailored to ByDesign and the other cloud offerings by SAP. To start, we're going to take a look at a bit about how development works in Business by Design, the process that's actually conducted in order to develop and use and deploy customizations. As part of this, we're going to start simple, and then we're going to go into more complex use cases. So starting at the very beginning, we're going to take a look at adding a little bit of extra checking for a sales order, in which case we're going to see if perhaps a duplicate exists. Moving on, we'll go into more advanced validation as far as using customer-specific or client-specific references or other checks that clients might want to use in order to help control the processes of ByDesign. After that, we're going to move into a more advanced use case in which you would be storing your own specific data in Business by Design. In this case, an approved supplier list that you can use to place additional controls on the purchasing process. From there, we're going to look a bit into how you would more easily manage this data as far as uploading data through file input. And lastly, we'll take a look at one way that you could automate your processes in use of a pretty common request that we've seen as far as automatic freight pricing on customer invoices. Once we've gone through that, we'll go on to the Q&A session. To start, we're going to take a look at the actual ByDesign Application Studio. So this is what it looks like. Anyone familiar with Visual Studio will see that this looks pretty similar. In order to use it, what you would do is set up a business user for development use in your ByDesign setting. And that's not very difficult. It's basically the same process you would use to set up a service agent or another business user. Once that's done, at that point, I'm actually able to log into your system. So when I click log on, it will allow me to select your system. And we can see through the URL and a brief nickname that I've given it, this is one example one. I'm just connecting directly. I use the username and password that's set up. And at that point, I can actually go in and start developing. So what's really nice here is that there's really no complex, VPN, special requirements required. I'm actually connecting directly to your system tenant. Once connected, it looks a little bit like this. We can see that you have a solution set in My Solutions, and these are all the solutions that exist within the tenant. In this case, we just see one. This is FMT1, in which I grouped all our webinar development that we're going to be going over today. But you can certainly have more than one, or you could have several dozen. It depends on what your custom development needs are. What's good about this is it lets you group the functionality into related topics. And so if you need to go through the process of changing, upgrading, patching your functionality, you can do it on a solution-by-solution basis. So the actual process of deploying or patching solutions is very straightforward. Once I double-click on it, I can actually see what's contained within the solution. In this case, I've grouped them into folders. We can see that we have an approved supplier list, which we'll be going over later, create on customer invoice, and then starting, we have some sales order-related customization. In this case, right now, we're going to look at a couple things. So I'll show you in the system what this looks like first. So as we go over into our sales orders, I'll show you the scenario that we're looking at. So we can see right now, more for testing purposes, that we have two sales orders that already exist and are open. Both of these have an external reference of example 1. We'll see why in just a second. In the meantime, I have a new sales order that's in preparation. And this is what I'll be looking at. So the first customization is a fairly common one. If you have a large sales team and orders that may be coming in through a common source, whether it's a common email with phone or fax directory, you want to make sure that people aren't accidentally entering orders that may be the same as another order. Through this, on most orders in most customer systems, they're going to put, if the customer provides a PO number, they're going to put it into the external reference field. So if I were to go in as a salesperson and enter the PO number, then when I save it, what we've created is this time, there's going to be a series of custom checks that'll let me know if, for example, this may be a duplicate sales order. And here we can see this is a custom message that the system has generated. We see sales order 2042 and sales order 2043 have the same external reference, the same thing that we can see here. Now, how does that work? Well, SAP provides one option for customization, and that's called a business object extension. What that does is it lets you take a standard SAP business object, like the sales order, and actually add some additional code, fields, or validations to it. So in this case, on the before save, here's the code that's involved. Now, I don't expect any customers to know what this is, but we're going to take a look at what's involved here. And we're actually using the standard data, and these are standard fields in the SAP sales order object. And we're going through a series of custom logic to actually determine what we're going to do. In this case, we're checking if the order is still in preparation and a buyer ID is specified. What we can do is we can actually query data within the system, and based on that data, execute custom scripts, messages, or other logic. In this case, we're actually querying the standard sales orders in ByDesign. So I'm actually looking at the sales order data, and I'm returning data based on the parameters I specify. In this case, I specified I only want to look at sales orders that have the same buyer party as the sales order that we're currently in. But I also want to look at sales orders that have the same buyer ID. And so once I have that, I actually execute the query, and then based on that, I may raise some messages. So if it finds in the standard system data that I have another sales order for this customer that has the same external reference, it's actually going to raise a message here. This is what this raise function does. And that's the message that we see within our screen. So this is probably the most basic type of customization. I'm not editing any data. I'm not stopping users from doing anything. I'm not putting any additional control. I'm merely informing the users that there may be something they need to be aware of. So for a simple customization like this, this is something that can be deployed easily and quickly after a basic testing process. However, you may find that maybe you need something more out of it. And this is what we're going to take a look at as far as additional validation. So another common use case is perhaps you don't want to let your sales staff release sales orders if they don't have an external reference. You want to make sure there's always a PO. It's another check that you want to put in place to ensure that the data is consistent. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons that we are requesting for custom development, is that you don't want to have people doing basic oversight on your processes. To the extent that you can eliminate any possibility of human error, that's something that's worth pursuing. And so in this case, we're going to take it a step further. So not only do we want to make it so that you can't release the sales order to fulfillment without an external reference, it may be that only certain customers require that. And so this is pulling up the customer record, what we can see next. So the use of extension fields is very common. Almost every ByDesign customer that we've seen uses them. We're going to take it a step further. So we can see that we have a customer extension field on the master record of our customer. So we can see the external reference required box is checked. So that would be one thing that any customer can do through front-end adaptation. Specify on the record that they need an external reference on any sales order. Where we can take it a step further is to actually use this to drive or provide additional oversight in the standard processes. So saying that we have this customer on our sales order, let's say I remove the external reference, so I don't have any specified, and then I try and release the order. Well, now I have an error. External reference must be entered to release sales order 2044. That is one big value add that can be done fairly simply. So not just am I raising messages to notify the end users, I'm actually putting additional controls and validations into your standard processes that make sure that what clients may consider invalid data is not allowed into the system. In this case, a sales order with no external reference being released. So what that looks like is that SAP allows within these business object extensions what they call action validation. These are, again, additional validations that we can add to standard system actions, in this case, the release and submit to approval process. So what we can see is that when I open it up, I'm looking and I go retrieve the customer data, and if I see that extension field has been checked, and there's no buyer ID specified, there's no external reference specified, not only can I raise a message for the end user, but I can also make sure that that action can't actually be executed. This one is really key. On sales orders on other data, we'll actually see action validations show up again once we get into the approved supplier list. But at this point, this is one of the most critical usages. So we tend to see with a lot of clients that, there's some level of client-specific functionalities that they want in place. They want additional restrictions, additional messages. They want some sort of additional level of control that makes sure that the data in the system is in the format and contains the information that is needed. In order to do so, we can add our extension field. And this way, this is actually a backend extension field that works identical to the same way that you add it through adaptation mode, is that we're adding an additional field here. And then we can specify what messages may appear for the customer. So in this case, we can see the one from earlier, our sales order duplicate buyer ID check. And then we can see this other one as part of the action validation. So the text that you see on the screen matches the text that we've specified in the Cloud Application Studio. Not only that, but as part of the messages we raise to users, we can actually specify that there are variables in this message that get filled in when the message is raised. In this case, we can see that we have a business transaction document ID, which is basically the sales order ID that you see. And so where we have our placeholder, we can ensure that the messages that the user sees are context and user relevant. So we're not just raising cryptic errors, we're actually telling the user exactly what the issue is. In addition to this, in the same way that you can add fields to screens, you have ways of adding fields to this standard screen through the backend too. We're not going to look at this in much detail as, again, it's almost identical to the standard system adaptation. From this point on, these are two simple examples, but we're going to move into something a little more complex. We're actually going to take a look at what's involved in storing and maintaining customer-specific data. In this case, the approved supplier list. Now, this functionality or this request for functionality tends to show up a lot, especially for any companies that may be biomedical, any companies that have certain restrictions in place as far as what they can order. We've seen other sides of this in the sense that you may want to put restrictions on what can be sold, but more commonly it's what can be purchased, and this may be related to internal quality requirements, regulatory requirements, FDA requirements if you're in the US, things of that nature. So we can see we actually have a custom work center in ByDesign. This approved supplier list is not a standard one, but it does show up alongside all the other work centers. So from a user perspective, where you're maintaining data does not seem that much different, and in fact sits right alongside all your standard system data. Not only that, the screens that we developed for maintaining our customer-specific data also look identical to the same screens that you would see in ByDesign. In this case, we see what looks like a standard object work list, and in fact it is. The context for this is that for a given supplier, we want to maintain which product can be purchased from that supplier. Now, for the purposes of the webinar, this is a fairly straightforward example. We've actually built to certain clients that have very specific, very rigorous requirements. We've built some more in-depth things. In this case, we just want to say whether there is a supplier, whether they may be allowed for purchase of all products. In this case, it tends to show up if you have intercompany suppliers, if you're doing any kind of intercompany transactions. They're not subject to the same restrictions or validations required for what would be an external supplier. So we have some additional boxes here. And then within it, we have each supplier has what type of product and the specific product that can be purchased. We can also, in the same way, we could create new ones, or we can edit existing ones. And again, as we go into edit mode, the screens look very familiar. They look just like a standard ByDesign screen, in which you can specify data, you can check boxes, you can add additional records, you can execute actions. All of the same functionality that you would be used to in standard SAP provided functionality, we can also create through partner enablement. Now, what does that actually look like in the SDK? In the SDK, or the Cloud Application Studio, SDK being short for Source Development Kit, we have what we call a business object, and that's a custom object that we create in SDK, or in the Cloud Application Studio. And what this does is it stores our customer-specific use case data. And by doing that, we can define as many fields as we want. We can define the type of fields that they are. We can define associations to SAP standard objects. So if I want to bring in data from the standard objects in the system, like a supplier in this case, then I can set these so that I can easily pull in data from other parts of the system that may be relevant in this case. We can supply other types of fields like indicators, IDs. We can also provide actions. And these are basically what would show up in a button you may click, and that will do or execute a specific function that relates to the object. We can have messages, as we saw in the business object extension, in that maybe we need to put validations on our custom data, and that's certainly possible too. In the same way, we may want to validate the external reference on the sales order. We may want to validate that we have a valid supplier ID on our custom business object. So that's certainly something we can do here too. We may want more structured data, so we can actually have data in a hierarchy. So not only do we have our standard header level, single table data, what you would see in most systems, we can actually have substructures that also store additional data in the same way that a sales order has items on it, or approved supplier list has products on it. And so within that, the product can also have its own fields, and it can have its own data associations to other standard SAP objects. It can have actions, and it can have messages too. So as we build our custom objects, it's not just a way of storing flat data structures or things of that nature. We can actually have a very robust set of fields, functions, and essentially build an object that is, to as much or as little complexity as you need. That sits right alongside the standard SAP objects, and that can be modified, edited, and maintained within the system in the same way that you would do for any of the standard SAP data. As we can see, the fields that we have here correspond to what we see on the screen. In this case, we have, for example, our supplier ID corresponds to the supplier ID on the screen. Now, as part of our custom business object, we can actually build the screen of the custom business object too. So in this case, we're going to take a look at what SAP calls the quick activity, or what most of you would know as the overview screen for any standard SAP object. Now, while that's loading, I'll also show that we have scripts as well. So in the same way that we can do business object extension scripts for standard SAP objects, we can actually also do our own scripts for our custom business objects. In this case, here's a very basic one that you would certainly want. When a supplier ID is entered, we make sure it's a valid supplier ID. So not only do we allow users to enter data, we also make sure that the data that the users enter is valid. And if it's not, we can communicate to them in the same way that we would on a business object extension, that they may need to alter or adjust the data. The way they interact with it, we can build as well. In this case, this is what the screen building looks like. It looks actually quite like the screens that you would see in ByDesign. But in this case, we actually can modify them. We can move them around. We can bring in additional data that users may want to see by looking at, in this case, this is our supplier association. And if we wanted to see more than just the name, we could bring that data in as well. In this case, so we're bringing in SAP standard data that sits right alongside our custom business object data. We can adjust what users see, how they see it, allow for them to interact with it in certain ways, provide them buttons to interact with. So essentially, we can make this as robust as we want. And so as we see here, this is a pretty straightforward example. It's relatively simple in its execution. But the purpose of the webinar here is really to show you kind of a basic approach to what's possible. Certainly as far as if you need something more complex or more advanced, it's very much possible to do through more advanced screens, more advanced custom business object definition, more specific scripts. So while what we see here is simple, it's by no means saying that you're restricted to only data or detail of this complexity. There's definitely more that you can do, and certainly it's something we can build depending on your use case and requirement. So don't feel that you're restricted upon seeing this kind of data. There's certainly more advanced things that you can do. So once we have our data, we have our screens, we have what we would consider next to be, where does this fit in to the standard SAP processes? And this is how, in the same way that we saw on the sales order, combining a customer extension field, that external reference required field, we're going to use another business object extension, and we're going to take it a step further. We're going to actually make our business object extension based on the data that we have created through the custom functionality. So I'll move over to the purchase orders here and show you how it interacts. So if I pull up a purchase order that I created, we can see the screen looks pretty straightforward here, but now there's one additional field. So for most cases, you'd be familiar with putting an extension field on the purchase order. Certainly that's not a problem. What we can do is actually take this a step further. You'll see this field is read-only. This is because we don't want the end users in the purchase order to be able to edit it. This field is actually driven off of code in our business object extension for the purchase order. And here's what it does. First, it does a number of validations to make sure we have enough data to actually check against the approved supplier list. So we're checking that the party is specified, the actual seller. We're also checking that a product is specified. If not, then we have, for customers, they may want to say, well, okay, if we're not buying a two-stock product, we're not buying a standard product, we do want to allow it. For other customers, they may say that if it's not on the list, it can't be purchased, and they don't want to allow it. And that's really where it gets into customer-specific logic and building customizations to match our customers. And that's really what we're focused about, is that, as we've seen, again, no two businesses are alike. Everyone may have their own custom way, their own specific way that they need to approach something. And that's what we focus on, is building to what our customers need instead of trying to build cookie cutter solutions that should fit everyone. Because we really want to make sure it can fit your requirement. From this, in this case, we then would execute a check. And this is a helpful functionality of the Cloud Application Studio as well, is we can build what's called a reuse library. And what I've done here is that I've built a library that allows me to run a set of code essentially wherever I want in the system. And what it will do is, based on some parameters passed in my case, the supplier, the type of product, and the product ID, it returns whether or not it's actually a valid product on my approved supplier list. What I'm doing in the same way that we saw when we went to the sales order and we're looking at other sales order data, I'm also, in this case, looking at the data of my custom business object. I'm querying the data, specifying the parameters, and if I find that the product is on the list for the supplier, then I say that it is a valid product for purchase. So again, querying data that's stored in the system and then using it as a basis for other data elsewhere in the system. And that's really key with the SDK, is that within the SDK or Cloud Application Studio, we're able to relate data from other parts of the system. We find that this can be a huge saving in time, in the sense that, for example, let's say you stored this information in Excel. Well, the last thing you want to do is have to go enter your purchase order in ByDesign, and at the same time also be looking at Excel too to see whether or not the products that you want to order are allowed. Not only that, this prevents you from having to also have someone else, like a manager, look at the purchase order and check the Excel document too. So there's huge savings to be made here by storing your data in the system. So not just from the end users or data entry users, but for the managers as well. It can save them a tremendous amount of time not having to constantly validate the data that the users are storing or maintaining. Now we can see what that looks like. In this case, we have some of these are approved for purchase and some of them aren't. Now what happens if I try and order it? Well, I get an error. It says that items 2 and items 3 are not approved for purchase from our supplier. And that's really key here. This means that your managers are not going to be getting purchase orders for approval that have invalid data on them. We can actually prevent the purchase order from moving further along in the process by putting an action validation. And as we can see through the Cloud Application Studio, that's what we have here. We have another action validation that actually stops a sales order from being submitted for approval. Basically, if I have any of the items where that box is not checked, what I can do is for each of those items raise a message to the end user and let them know that the item that was on the purchase order is not valid for purchase. So again, we have our combination of custom data. In this case, we've taken it a step beyond extension fields and actually put it into entirely custom objects with our entirely custom data. But we're still using that in the standard processes, and that's really key, is that the data that we're maintaining through our custom development here is relevant, and it ties into the standard processes that you would want it to be used in. There aren't separate human-required checks or steps needed to actually pull in this data and use it to drive customer-specific functionality. The next step to this, now that we've built our customer-specific data, now that we've integrated that data within the system backend, into a standard SAP object. And a note on that, which is particularly critical, is when I say backend, it really does sit and run wherever the functionality is run in any circumstance. So where this becomes really useful is that, let's say you have purchase orders that get generated through an integration to an external system. Even with that integration, the code that we built here is still going to run. So even a purchase order coming in that may be coming in through web services or some other integration will still be subject to the checks here that we've enabled. And so another common example is sales orders. Many customers have e-commerce integration, and the sales orders come in through e-commerce, and there may be modifications that need to get made to them. There may be validations that need to occur with those. Those same validations are going to occur regardless of where the order has come from, whether it's come from Excel upload, whether it was keyed in manually through the ByDesign front end, or whether it came in through a web service. They will all be subject to the same validations that we created in our custom solution here. That's really key to keep the data integrity intact. And ByDesign does that standard out of the box. There's nothing special that I have to do to make sure that that's enabled and running for all different scenarios that may be subject to the same level of validation required. Now, certainly, if you have customer-specific requirements, like perhaps in a sales order scenario where you're receiving e-commerce orders, that those orders aren't subject to those same checks, that's possible too. We can put in additional, let's say, a checkbox that indicates it's an e-commerce order, and then the action validation may see that the box is checked and not execute. So it really is about building it to your specific requirement. We don't try and anticipate what everything could possibly be. We work with you, we find your requirements, and we build to what we determine as the appropriate specifications for them. So once we have that, certainly you can hand key the data in, as we may see through our approved supplier list work center. But in our case, well, maybe that, let's say we've got hundreds of suppliers, maybe we have thousands of suppliers. We don't necessarily want to have to hand key in that level of data. ByDesign provides a number of different ways of receiving data. In one case, we'll see that you can upload data through what SAP calls file input. And file input, for some of you that may be using this for SAP provided out-of-the-box scenarios, is actually, it's a standard work center in application and user management. But what we see is that we have a custom file input, and this is our approved supplier list input. And what this does is that we can upload data in the standard way, but we can actually have that data generate objects for the custom business object that we specify. So in this case, the scenario that we typically see is that users like working in Excel. So we allow them to manage their data in Excel to start. And again, as a developer, I've experienced in Visual Basic. So what we can create is a macro-enabled Excel workbook. And we can see that the data that I've entered here will match the data that we see in ByDesign. And so we can see that I have one sheet that allows me to specify what approved suppliers do I want to upload. In this case, I see these 4. If we go back into ByDesign, we can also see that those are the 4 lists in ByDesign as well. Next, I can see that in addition, I need some products for those suppliers. So I can say which supplier, the type of product it is, and what the ID for the product is. So I've now maintained all this data. In this case, I can see that supplier S100401 has these products, these 3 products available as approved products. And when I look in the system, again, I see those same 3 products available. So what we can see here is that the data that I'm uploading will match the data in the system. From that point on, I can actually run a macro that's built related to this file that generates XML data. And the XML data looks a little bit like this. Now, it's not something that you would typically open up as an end customer. It's meant to be read by the system, parsed by the system, so you don't typically have to look at it. But the key takeaway here is that in addition to just uploading our custom data generated through XML, you may have occasion to do this through, you may want to do this for standard system data. And so we can do that too. It's something that comes up, well, not as frequently as the other requests that we get, is that we can generate this type of data for SAP to read, parse, and use in its standard processes. So what you would do is this file would be generated through Excel, and we jump over into File Input, go to our unprocessed files. We go ahead and add that file that was generated, and we can add it to our service interface. So we browse for the file, and it would upload into ByDesign. So I've put a link to that file from my personal computer, and I'm going to upload it into ByDesign. Now, one thing that's pretty key here is that in addition to just doing it from the personal computer, there's actually other levels of integration that you can use to help automate these processes. For example, let's say you have an external system that you manage this in, but you don't need or you don't want to build a full integration to ByDesign. You just want to be able to process this data as it's maintained in the external system. Well, what SAP offers as part of its standard functionality is what they call a web DAV folder. And that is an internet accessible folder that you would just apply username and password to that lets you push files into it. You can think of it as maybe a SharePoint or another online directory, but it's basically just a folder that you can put files into. And those same files are going to show up in this unprocessed files. At that point, you can execute your approved supplier list file input run, and that will take the data, and based on that data, it will generate the standard objects in ByDesign. And that's really key, is that you can actually provide a way so that you don't have to hand key this data in. You can just upload it. Certainly for, again, hundreds or thousands of documents you want them to do as part of data migration, the last thing you want to have to do is hand key them in. And that's what this provides, is a way of uploading data. But not only that, on an ongoing basis, you may have occasion to upload additional ones. And through that, you can use this as well and actually integrate it directly to an external system using the web DAV. To take it a step further, though we're not going to go into it in detail, you can actually also integrate this data through what it calls a external service integration. And through this, we can actually do it through a web service. While we won't cover it in too much detail, you can actually see that I can create a service accessible to an external website and allow it to populate data from an external website. This works in the same way that you may populate data through an e-commerce integration, through any sort of the SAP standard integrations where you're taking data from an external web system and pushing it into ByDesign. We can do the same thing here for your custom business objects. So even if you have additional customer data that's maintained within an external system, you want to have it in ByDesign, but you find it easier or for whatever reason need to maintain it outside of ByDesign, we can still build those integrations into ByDesign in which you're actually maintaining or you're at least replicating that data and synchronize it so it can be used in these back-end checks like we saw with the sales order or the purchase order. So that is, again, really key in that not only are you able to store data in ByDesign, you're able to maintain data in ByDesign in ways that should really, really cut down on the level of human effort or human intervention required. So again, while this is a relatively simple example, it's just sort of a taste of what you can do through custom data in ByDesign, is that you're able to put additional validation, you're able to store data, you're able to link that data to the standard processes and use it to really help maintain your data, to keep the data integrity of your system strong, to cut down on the amount of human oversight or opportunity for human error. Is all really key in these custom data scenarios and the ability to link it to standard ByDesign data. The last one we're going to cover is actually, to some extent, what we've seen already, but this shows another example where we're taking standard data from two parts of the system and linking them together. In this case, what we've done, and this is actually a common requirement we've seen quite a bit, is that we want to be able to put a freight price on our outbound delivery and then use that freight price as actual freight that shows up on the customer invoice. So most people have gotten to the step where they are able to enter freight. And for some integrations, you may have that step where it's coming in from an external system, like one of the integrations or something else. And it may populate a field similar to this. So without customization, well, what do you have to do? Well, the person processing the invoice has to go pull up the outbound delivery, look at the freight price, and then key it in onto the customer invoice. Through our integration, we can actually retrieve that in the back end, and we can actually not only retrieve it, but use it to drive the freight on the customer invoice itself. And so we can see that this is the invoice generated as part of the released outbound delivery. And we can see here's the freight price. And to actually see that in action, if I remove it and resave it, it's actually going to go retrieve the freight price from the outbound delivery and put it back onto the invoice. Certainly for more complex scenarios, so you may not always want it to do that, but it's definitely a possibility. And again, what we're looking at, in the same way that on a sales order, we query other sales orders and we want to see data from those sales orders. In this case, on the outbound delivery or in the customer invoice, we want to go see if does the customer invoice have an outbound delivery, and we're actually checking that here. And if it does have one, we'll go look for the outbound deliveries, go grab the data from that freight price field, and go store it. And then if it does have a freight price, we can delete the standard system estimated or provided freight price and actually create a new one with our own logic. So again, with fairly little additional functionality, where this isn't custom objects, it's just a custom field, but we're actually driving this field to maintain standard system data. And this one is probably one of the most common that we get, in the sense that you want to be able to modify data, not just read data, not just prevent actions or add additional validation, but actually alter the data in ByDesign based on your own custom logic or perhaps additional extension fields that you may enter. And that's why this is a really key customization, is that this just gets done automatically. If before you found that in order to invoice, you had to have someone go in, check the price on the outbound delivery, check the price on the invoice, populate it over, well, you've eliminated that step. And if that was the one manual step that had to be conducted for customer invoicing, you've now just entirely automated a process that previously had to be conducted manually. And that's probably one of the biggest time savers that we see. Well, this isn't terribly complex functionality. What we've done is we've removed the manual step from the process. And certainly with any ERP system, most people would agree the less clicks, the better. That's what we've done here. We've just eliminated a whole bunch of clicks. And in fact, you could actually now start doing your invoicing on an automated run. And your accountants would certainly thank you. So The last one, and probably the biggest impact that we can see with fairly low effort, is the ability to modify standard by design data to fit customer-specific requirements. With that, I know it's been kind of quick and we've gone through a lot, but we've seen some of the most effective ways that we can help customers automate processes, manage data, provide additional visibility to end customers, or other things of that nature. And we do it in ByDesign while preserving data integrity, running in every scenario that it's required, and doing it through the Cloud Application Studio. So at this point, we've covered most of the material, and I'd like to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions about what you've seen today, or you may have questions about, for example, maybe a particular use case that you may have, I'll look at the questions box, and I'll see if there's anything that I can answer here. So if you have questions now, don't feel afraid to ask. Go ahead and put them in the box, and I'll take a look.